At 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in November, Wade Fontaine noticed a silver sedan parked on level 4 of the Mercy Regional parking deck with its engine off, its windows beginning to fog from the inside, and its driver still sitting behind the wheel. He had seen plenty of things on the overnight shift. People crying in their cars after a hard diagnosis. Families sleeping in shifts while someone upstairs fought for their life. He understood the parking deck the way he understood the building itself, as a place where people came apart quietly, without wanting anyone to witness it. But the woman in the silver sedan had been there when he arrived at 10 o'clock the previous night, and she was still there now. Wade was 39 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had repaired more hospital infrastructure than he could name without a logbook. He worked the overnight maintenance shift because the differential pay covered his daughter's after-school program, and because the daytime guys got most of the plumbing emergencies. He had done this for 6 years. His wife, Erin, had died in a highway accident when Faye was 4 years old, and the overnight shift had become the architecture of his survival. Sleep while she's at school, wake up when she comes home, hand her off to Dottie Ferris across the hall when he left at 9. He parked his maintenance cart and crossed the oil-stained concrete toward the car. The temperature had dropped below 40. He could see his breath. The woman inside was sitting upright, her coat pulled tight, a leather tote bag on the passenger seat beside a cardboard file box, and a single photograph placed face down on the dashboard. She was perhaps 38, with dark auburn hair that had been carefully styled once, and was now pushed to one side as though sleep had argued with it and won. Even through the fogged glass, there was something deliberate about her posture, the set of her jaw, the stillness of her hands folded in her lap. She was not a person who had run out of gas. She was a person who had run out of options and was deciding very carefully whether to let that show. Wade tapped the window twice. The woman's eyes opened. For one sharp second, pure fear crossed her face. Then something harder replaced it. She lowered the window 2 inches. "I'm maintenance," Wade said, touching the patch on his jacket. "I noticed you've been here since last night. It's getting cold." She studied him the way a person studies someone they don't yet trust but cannot afford to dismiss. "I'm aware of the temperature. There's a break room on the 2nd floor. Staff only, but I have access. You could sit somewhere warm until morning." She said nothing. "There's coffee," he added. "It's bad coffee, but it's hot." Something shifted in her face, too small to name. She opened the door. Her name was Sloane, she told him. Nothing else. Wade did not push. He walked her to the service elevator and unlocked the break room without ceremony, the way he did everything on the overnight shift, without performance, without expectation of acknowledgement. The coffee was indeed bad. She wrapped both hands around the paper cup and drank it anyway. Wade found a granola bar from the supply cabinet, the kind that came in bulk, dense and slightly stale, and set it on the table in front of her without asking whether she wanted it. She looked at it for a moment the way someone looks at something they had forgotten they needed. Then she ate all of it, including the crumbs that fell onto the wrapper. Wade went back to work. He had a leaking pipe collar to reseal on the 3rd floor and a ventilation panel that had been rattling since the previous Thursday. He moved steadily through the building, pausing only when equipment required a second hand he didn't have. There was a quiet efficiency in the way he worked at that hour, unhurried but not slow, a man performing a job that no one would notice until he stopped doing it. Sloane watched him through the break room window when he passed, and she recognized something that had become unfamiliar to her in recent weeks. A person who was not performing competence. He simply had it. At 4:15, his phone vibrated. He stepped into the hallway to answer. His voice, low and even, said the same thing twice. "I'll be home soon, I promise." When he came back, his expression had already closed the subject. "Your kid?" she asked. "Daughter. She had a nightmare." He poured a second cup of coffee. "Happens more in winter for some reason." Sloane Rafferty had spent the last 11 days believing she had made every wrong decision available to her. She had trusted the wrong person. She had built something she could not protect. She had stood in her own kitchen and watched her husband deliver the news, with extraordinary practiced calm, that the board had voted to place her on administrative leave. He spoke as though informing her of a scheduling conflict he personally regretted. What she had not yet decided was what to do next. She had been the chief operating officer of the Rafferty Helm Health System for 6 years. Her father, Edward Rafferty, had founded the organization as a small regional clinic in Macon, Georgia, 30 years earlier. He believed, with the kind of conviction that made people uncomfortable at dinner parties, that a health system's primary obligation was to the patients who could least afford to go elsewhere. By the time he died of a stroke 4 years ago, the organization had grown to 7 facilities across northern Georgia. He left operational control to Sloane, and the board chairmanship to a trust structured to protect the founding mission. Her husband, Derek Stahl, had joined the organization as General Counsel 5 years into their marriage. He was precise, persuasive, and exceptionally skilled at making people feel that his decisions were their own ideas. Sloane had once considered this a gift. She later understood it as a methodology. Derek had spent 2 years cultivating board members, arranging quiet dinners, facilitating introductions, gradually framing Sloane's careful approach to expansion as sentimentality dressed up as strategy. When Sloane discovered that 3 legal contracts had been steered to firms with undisclosed financial connections to his private investment accounts, he did not deny it. He told her the arrangements were standard, that she was misreading the documentation, and that her escalating suspicions were beginning to concern people who genuinely admired her. The federal grant was what changed everything. Sloane had secured $7 million in federal funding to open 3 community health clinics in underserved neighborhoods in southwest Atlanta. She had spent 14 months designing the program. Staffing models, service tiers, community partnership agreements. The grant had been awarded under her name and her projections. After placing her on leave, Derek presented the board with a revised program plan that reclassified the clinics as Phase 2, contingent on market performance metrics that no underserved neighborhood could realistically meet. In their place, he proposed a downtown medical tower that would generate premium revenue and elevate the system's national ranking profile. He also filed an internal complaint alleging that Sloane had manipulated patient outcome data to secure the federal grant. The allegation was false. The data had been audited twice before submission and reviewed by the grant agency's own analysts, but the complaint triggered a federal compliance review, which froze Sloane's signatory authority and gave the board legal cover to maintain her leave indefinitely. Her attorney advised compromise. Her professional email was suspended, her access card deactivated. A former colleague offered a guest room, then called back 2 hours later to say the timing was complicated. She parked first near the airport, then near a rest stop, and finally outside the hospital, the building she had helped design the expansion wing of, and told herself the situation was temporary. Wade had found her on the 3rd night. His neighbor, Dottie Ferris, was 68 years old and had raised 4 children in a 2-bedroom apartment without ever treating a shortage of space as a reason to turn someone away. When Wade described the woman he'd found in the parking deck, Dottie said nothing for a moment, then pointed at the storage room behind the laundry alcove. "There's a cot in there from when my grandson visited. It's clean." Sloane spent the first night calculating liability and the second night too tired to calculate anything. Dottie brought soup both times and issued one standing instruction: stop apologizing for needing a place to sleep. Faye, who was 10 years old and had her father's habit of watching people closely before speaking, met Sloane on a Saturday afternoon. She noticed the hospital badge in the file box immediately, the silver lanyard still threaded through the clip. She picked it up and read the name printed beneath the photograph. "This is you," she said. "Yes." Faye set it down. "My dad works at that hospital." She said nothing more about it until the following morning, when the local news ran a segment on the Rafferty-Helm compliance review. A financial correspondent stood in front of the system's administrative offices and spoke about allegations of data manipulation and a federal grant program under scrutiny. A photograph showed Sloane leaving a legal building with her eyes lowered. The Chiron read "on leave as health system pivots community program." Faye looked from the television to the woman eating toast at their kitchen table. "You're the one they're talking about." Wade was standing at the stove. He turned slowly. Sloane's posture did not change. She set her toast down and waited for what she had been waiting for since the moment she told Wade her name, the recognition that reorganized everything. With most people, it produced a subtle recalibration. Warmth became calculation. Concern became positioning. Wade looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You should have told me." "I told you my name. You knew I didn't understand what it meant. Would you have helped me if you had?" He picked up the spatula again. "Yes, but I would have understood why there's been a gray Audi parked across the street since Thursday morning." Sloane looked toward the window. The car was there. Wade's voice was careful. "They work for Derek?" "His attorneys use a private security firm. They document my movements and report anything that can be characterized as erratic behavior." Wade's jaw tightened. He said nothing for several seconds. Then quietly, "They stay outside. You stay here. Tomorrow we figure out something safer, no more surprises. She wanted to tell him she couldn't promise that. At this point, surprises were her only remaining resource. The photograph of Wade and Sloane in the parking deck, taken from the Audi, appeared on a local business blog the following morning, paired with a caption suggesting the suspended COO had found shelter with a hospital employee. A columnist described it as a calculated play for public sympathy. A second blog asked whether the relationship had begun before the separation. Wade's shift supervisor called before 7. "You brought a liability into our facility." "I found someone cold in the parking deck." "There are policies." "There's no policy against keeping someone from hypothermia. There is a policy about unauthorized access to staff-only areas after hours." His shift supervisor position was suspended pending administrative review. 2 days later, an HR email arrived using language that meant termination without using the word. Wade sat at the kitchen table and stared at his coffee mug. He had a little over $300 in his checking account, rent due in 10 days, and a daughter whose school lunches he packed with the precision of someone who understood that the small things were sometimes the only things he could control. Sloane stood in the doorway. "I'll cover your wages while this is sorted out. I have access to." "Don't." His voice was flat. "Wade, you don't get to write a check so you can feel less responsible for this." He looked at her directly. "I helped you because you needed help. That's not a transaction." She flinched the way a person flinches when they've been corrected in exactly the right place. He saw it and did not soften what he'd said, because he also understood it needed to be said without the softening. Faye stood in the hallway, pretending to look at her sneakers. "I was raised to believe everyone wants something," Sloane said quietly. Wade looked at her a long moment. "Then maybe you've spent too long around people who do." Derek called that evening. Sloane answered on speaker, and Wade listened from the kitchen without moving. Derek's voice carried the quality of reasonable patience being offered to an unreasonable situation. "You've made your point. Come back to the table. This ends with your reputation mostly intact." "My reputation is intact. You've been manufacturing a version of it that isn't." "Perception has a way of becoming its own kind of truth, Sloane." A pause. "Your father understood that. He built the whole thing on goodwill, not margins. You inherited a mission and mistook it for a mandate." She said nothing. "The grant review panel meets in 3 weeks," he continued. "If you haven't resigned before then, we present the compliance finding publicly. What that does to your license, your professional standing, I genuinely cannot control that." She ended the call. That night, doubt returned the way it always did at that hour, not loudly, but like cold air finding a gap in a window frame. Sloane lay on the cot in Dottie's storage room, listening to the building settle around her, thinking about everyone who had entered the radius of her situation. Wade had lost income he could not spare. Faye had been approached by a classmate whose parent had read the blog post. Dottie's building manager had made a pointed comment about lease language. Before dawn, Sloane packed in the dark without turning on the light. She left an envelope with the last accessible cash she had, and a note thanking Wade for showing her that decency still existed as a practical position, not merely a sentiment. Then she carried her bag down the back staircase and sat in the silver sedan. The settlement agreement was open on her phone. She would resign. She would surrender her federal grant authority. She would sign a non-disclosure agreement covering all board communications, legal proceedings, and the community clinic program. Her professional license review would be closed. Her accounts would be unfrozen. She reached toward the screen. Then she opened the file box on the passenger seat, not looking for anything specific, the way a person handles familiar objects in the middle of the night. The bottom of the box held a printed compliance packet she had never opened, sent automatically to the Rafferty Trust Administrator months earlier as a routine documentation copy. She had assumed it was boilerplate. Inside was a printed email chain. Derek had written to an outside consultant in February. "We need the original outcome projections reframed. If Sloane's baseline numbers appear unsupportable under revised federal metrics, the board will approve the program pivot without pushback. Make the methodology look like overreach." Below that, a consultant's reply, "Understood. We can adjust the confidence intervals to create the appearance of statistical inflation." Derek's response, "Good. Once her version looks like advocacy dressed as data, the rest takes care of itself." Sloane read the chain 3 times. She sat without moving for 4 minutes. Then she heard a knock on the driver's window, 2 taps, unhurried. Wade stood in the parking lot in his jacket, his hair unsettled from sleep. He had found the note beside the coffee maker. He had followed the tire tracks visible in the thin overnight frost, the same way she had driven this same route 3 times before. He knocked exactly as he had the first night. She lowered the window. "I was leaving," she said. "I noticed." He leaned against the doorframe. "Faye is furious. She says you took the granola bar from the cabinet without asking." He paused. "She packed it for you herself. She just didn't tell you." Sloane pressed her hand over her mouth. "You don't protect people by deciding they're too fragile to stand next to you," Wade said. "I have a daughter and a broken radiator and $300. I'm still standing." She held up the printed email. "I found something." He didn't ask what. He waited. "The grant review hearing is public," she said. "Because federal funds are involved, the panel is required to take public testimony." "When?" 11 days. "Can they stop you from going?" She thought of the suspended access, the compliance freeze, the NDA she had not yet signed. "They can try." Wade straightened. "Then let's go back inside. It's cold." The federal grant review for the Rafferty Community Health Initiative was held at the Peachtree Federal Building on a Thursday morning in December. The auditorium seated 200. Grant analysts, housing advocates, neighborhood council representatives, and community health workers filled most of the rows. Derek arrived with a legal team and a presentation prepared by consultants who had been coached on what not to say directly. Rochelle Baird, the system's VP of strategy, a composed, deliberate woman who had been Derek's close ally through every phase of the board restructure, sat behind him, reviewing documents with the stillness of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. Sloane entered through the main doors in a blazer Dottie had borrowed from her eldest daughter. It was slightly too long in the sleeves and a shade too formal for the situation. She walked with the composure of a person who no longer required her clothing to explain her authority. Wade was beside her. Dottie sat in the back row in a red cardigan. Faye was at school, but she had extracted a promise. "Call the moment it's done." The room shifted. Derek's expression moved through surprise, then recovery, then a smile that did not reach his eyes. Rochelle stopped turning pages. A junior administrator approached the registration table. She glanced toward Derek's side of the room before speaking. "Mrs. Rafferty, I was instructed that you're not authorized to present. I am the grant recipient. Federal transparency guidelines require the panel to accept testimony from the named recipient upon request." Sloane said it the same way she had once said it in board meetings, not loudly, not aggressively, simply as a fact that did not require defense. The administrator stepped aside. Review Chair Commissioner Raymond Lusk called the session to order. Derek presented first. His slides were polished. His language described the program pivot as a responsible realignment of community health strategy in response to evolving data quality concerns. He named Sloane's methodology twice as the source of those concerns without naming her directly, a technique that required preparation. Commissioner Lusk frowned. The original grant application was approved by this agency following a 2-stage independent review. "Are you suggesting the agency approved flawed data?" Derek smiled with diplomatic patience. "I'm suggesting the data evolved after submission in ways that weren't flagged appropriately at the time." Sloane rose from her seat in the back. "Commissioner Lusk, I'd like to respond to that characterization." The room held its breath. She walked to the front, connected her laptop to the presentation system using the building's public guest login, because her own credentials had been suspended, and opened the original grant data. She walked the panel through each dataset Derek had described as inflated, showing the agency's own approval documentation alongside it. Side by side, the numbers were identical. The methodology Derek had called overreach was the same methodology his own consultants had reviewed and cleared before submission. Then she opened the email chain. Derek rose. "Those communications are internal. They were sent to the Rafferty Trust Administrator as a routine compliance copy. They are part of the trust record, not the protected legal file." Sloane read the relevant section aloud, clearly, without inflection. The auditorium went very still. She continued. She walked through the revised program plan line by line, showing how the community clinic funding had been redirected into the medical tower through a reclassification that technically complied with grant language while completely replacing its purpose. 3 neighborhood council representatives rose to confirm that their communities had received no notification of the change. A representative from a local credit union said his organization had restructured its own lending programs around the original clinic timeline, and now those programs were in jeopardy. Derek attempted to interrupt 4 times. Each time, Commissioner Lusk asked him to wait. When the data presentation was finished, Sloane reached into her file box and placed a sealed envelope on the table. This is a formal request under Section 11B of the Rafferty Founding Trust for the Trust Administrator to exercise independent audit authority over any executive action taken during a period in which the named heir was under contested administrative review. She looked directly at Derek for the first time since entering the room. My father wrote that clause after someone tried to take this organization from him through a proxy vote 30 years ago. He believed in building systems that outlasted individual loyalty. The trust administrator, who had been seated quietly in an observer chair throughout, opened the envelope, conferred briefly with the agency's legal counsel, and approached the microphone. The announcement was precise and without drama. Derek Stahl's signatory authority over the Rafferty Helm Grant program was suspended effective immediately, pending an independent audit of all executive decisions made during the administrative leave period. The federal compliance review of Sloane's original data was simultaneously suspended, as its initiating complaint had itself become the subject of audit. Derek stood motionless beside his chair. Rachel began gathering her documents. Commissioner Lusk instructed her to remain available for questions regarding the consulting contract relationships. Outside, reporters clustered on the building steps. Someone called Sloane's name. Someone asked whether she planned to return as CO. A third voice asked whether Wade was her new partner. Wade stood slightly behind her, uncomfortable in the way people are uncomfortable with things they haven't agreed to. Sloane raised one hand. Today was about 3 clinics that were removed from a program budget because the neighborhoods they were designed to serve were inconvenient to a different financial model, she said. It was about employees who were pressured to attach their names to documentation they knew was incomplete. Everything else will be addressed through the appropriate process. A reporter stepped forward. Is the man with you here in a personal capacity? Sloane glanced at Wade before answering. He is here because he is someone who does not decide another person's worth based on what they can offer him in return. She paused. Most people say they believe in that. He simply does it. The independent audit ran for 6 weeks. It confirmed that Derek had routed consulting fees through firms with undisclosed board connections, that the internal misconduct complaint against Sloane had been drafted weeks before the data discrepancy it was supposedly prompted by, and that Rachel had used her strategic access to shape the board's understanding of the data quality issue. Derek resigned before the formal findings were released. His letter cited personal reasons and ran 2 paragraphs. Sloane was reinstated as COO. Her license review was closed. Her accounts were unfrozen. The board asked whether she intended to pursue legal action. She said she would leave that to the process that now had everything it needed. She did not move back into the house she and Derek had shared. She visited once, with a property officer, and left carrying her father's original clinic photographs, a box of his operational journals, and nothing else. The house sold in the spring. She directed her portion of the proceeds into an independent foundation supporting rural health outreach. She did not attach her name to the foundation. When advisors argued that public association would accelerate her professional rehabilitation, she said, "A reputation that depends on displaying every decent act is just another form of advertising." Wade accepted the position of facilities director for the first community clinic when it opened the following October. He had initially assumed the role was symbolic, a gesture, a thank you dressed as a job title. Sloane corrected that assumption in their first working meeting. "You once told me that nobody ever asks the people who repair buildings what actually needs to change before they design them." I said that once. I wrote it down. He found things the architects had missed. An HVAC layout pushing cold air directly onto the intake desk, storage closets too narrow for a standard medical cart, a loading area requiring after-hours deliveries to cross unlit pavement. The plans were revised. Nobody announced that he had found these things. They were simply fixed. Faye visited the clinic on opening day wearing a hard hat that slipped over her eyes and spent 20 minutes interrogating the HVAC contractor about airflow calculations until the contractor pulled up a technical schematic to show her. Dottie brought food for the staff and found fault with the placement of every chair in the waiting room. 3 months later, the chairs were repositioned based on her suggestions, and the waiting area moved considerably better. At the opening ceremony, a local journalist asked Sloane whether she felt vindicated. She looked past him toward the parking area, where Wade was in a good-natured argument with a contractor about a drain placement, and Faye was standing on a concrete block trying to see over her father's shoulder. I feel like someone who had very little room in his own life made room for me anyway, she said, without asking what he'd get in return, without being certain I had earned it. She paused. That isn't vindication. That's something harder to come by. Wade drove Faye home in his truck. Sloane followed in the silver sedan. At a red light on the way back through the city, his truck slowed for a yellow and she pulled up beside him. He glanced over. She raised a paper coffee cup. The kind from the clinic's break room, bad coffee, the same kind she'd wrapped her hands around on the first night. He shook his head, but he was smiling when he did it. The light turned green. Neither of them had designed this version of their lives. Wade still reached some mornings for his phone to text Aaron about something Faye had done, and the absence arrived a half-second before the memory, as it always had. Sloane still had nights when Derek's voice came back to her. You turned a mission into a monument, and she had to decide again not to let it be the last word on anything. But deciding, she had found, was something you could practice until it became easier. And most evenings, driving back through a city she had helped change in small and permanent ways, she felt primarily the distance between the woman who had sat in that parking deck and the one she was still in the process of becoming. Her father had written, in the front cover of his first operational journal, a single sentence: build places where people feel safe. She had spent years believing he meant the buildings. Standing in a newly finished clinic waiting room one afternoon, watching a woman with 3 children approach a registration desk for the first time in years. Nervous, hopeful, unsure of her welcome. Sloane understood that her father had meant something far more difficult to construct, and something far more difficult to take away once it was built properly.